Well, hi, I'm Tom Olivier, and I'll just do a quick introduction. I know many of you are painfully aware of what comprehensive plans are, but I do want to say a few words about what they are and what the law requires as kind of setup for some of the discussion tonight, because I think some people here are not so steeped in all of this. Before I forget, the meeting is sponsored by the Piedmont Group of the Sierra Club, the 350 Charlottesville Albemarle Climate Group, and the Seville 100 Climate Alliance. And our master of Zoom tonight is James Groves, who's very kind to do this for us. James is a professor in the engineering school at UVA with a specialty in engineering, and he does this sort of thing for all of the Seville 100 meetings practically, and he's very helpful and good at it, and we appreciate it. For those of you who are not familiar with comprehensive plans, this is a fundamental planning document required by Virginia law for local governments. The plan has to be updated every 5 years, and Virginia law also states that it's to be prepared by planning commissions, although planning staff and consultants can provide support to planning commissioners, and the boards of supervisors or city councilors have a sort of final oversee in terms of approval of a comprehensive plan. An update of the Albemarle County Comprehensive Plan is underway. Planning staff have been proposing many breaks with past tradition or many breaks from recent Albemarle County comprehensive plans in terms of structures, and we're not sure, perhaps policies. And this has led to some concern among members of the environmental community, climate action community, and perhaps others as to just where the new plan is going. And so some of us thought it would be useful for some of us citizens who are concerned to invite planning commissioners to come meet outside of the formal planning commission meetings to discuss the update, share with us their ideas on what the big issues are remaining in the plans, and perhaps give us a chance to talk about the things that concern us, with the idea being that, one, we may get a better plan out of the process, and it may well energize some people to become active and participate as citizens in the remainder of the update process. Happily, we had two commissioners agree to participate. One is Karen Firehock, who's waved her hand there. Thanks to Karen. That's great. Karen is the director of the Green Infrastructure Center, which does consulting for conservation, biodiversity conservation planning for governments from localities to higher levels, at least to the state that I'm aware of. And so Karen is very aware of a lot of environmental issues. This is what her day job is. And Lonnie Murray, who is, among other things, Lonnie's there. He is a member of the Natural Heritage Committee for years. Lonnie was chair of the committee. He also was a board member at the Thomas Jefferson Soil and Water District. So Lonnie, too, is very steeped in many ways in environmental issues, and we're fortunate to have both of them come join us tonight. Our meeting format is pretty simple. We've offered up to 20 minutes to each of our guest planning commissioners to share with us their thoughts about key ideas in the remainder of their plans or things they'd like to see happen. And then we'd follow that with questions and answers. And Lonnie and Karen have agreed that Karen will go first. So with that, I'll turn it over to Karen to share her thoughts with us.
Thanks very much for having me, everybody. I want to set the table for this evening's discussion. And the way I want to do that is to explain kind of where the county is in the process with regards to the environment section of the comp plan. So in the big picture, the process that the county chose to undertake involves first having their consultants do research and work with staff to come up with ideas for the comprehensive plan's update. They then put those ideas out to the public. The public comments on them. Then those ideas and comments come for the first time, usually to the planning commission. And then we see them. So In the chat, I put, and I'm not asking you to go there right now at this second, unless Lonnie and I are boring and you want to do something else. But in the chat is a link to comment on the county's draft environmental goals. So the county has a survey out to comment on what the goals that they put forward so far and what they're calling their objectives. So why I wanted to give you that background is so that you all on this call know that the Planning Commission did not draft the goals and objectives that are currently on that site. So Lonnie and I have not had a opportunity to dig into those. I mean, we've read them, but we haven't had a chance to actually comment on them. We haven't had a Planning Commission work session on them. So the con of that statement is that I can't really, tell you why a particular goal was put forward or why a particular objective is put forward, because we didn't make them. On the plus side, because we haven't had our work session yet, I'm really interested to hear your comments just generally on the environment and things that you think should be covered in the comprehensive plan update, so that Lonnie and I both will take those comments forward to the Planning Commission. So there's many ways to comment. You can tell us things tonight. We'll take notes and we'll definitely have that information to share with the Planning Commission. You can go directly to the link that I provided. And then also I want to note that there have been quite a few public meetings held around the county and pop-up events as well for people to comment. So there's been a lot of public engagement already. And we're sort of in I'll call it the messy middle of the comprehensive planning process. So with that, I sort of picked some ideas and I guess topics that I think are really important that I hope that this comprehensive plan will address. My quick list I'm going to run by you is by no means a list of everything that I think should go in the comp plan. We did not get invited to an 8-hour webinar. So I'm just going to hit some highlights of things that are of particular interest to me. Lonnie will follow up and he will bring up probably many more ideas. So with that, let me start with, I'm going to start in and work out. So I'm going to start with the urban ring. So as you know, the county's policies for growth is to try to direct most of the growth into the urban ring surrounding Charlottesville and also up 29 north of Charlottesville, as well as at Crozet. Those are sort of the main growth areas. And it has let's say a positive effect in that it does protect large swaths of our natural resources, in our rural areas, because we're trying to push people to live in the urban ring. Now, there's two challenges. Well, there's more than two challenges, but I'll pick on two. Because the urban ring is surrounded by surrounding a very popular city, and the neighborhoods around Charlottesville are also quite wonderful. The urban ring is popular, the demand is high to live there, and so it's pretty unaffordable. It's become very expensive to live there. So on the one hand, we really want to push people to live in the urban ring, but it's actually not affordable for many in our community. So affordable housing is another key aspect of the comprehensive plan that we have to improve on and get right, because if we can't make the urban ring affordable, then we really can't succeed in our growth management policy that is designed to protect our rural areas. So that's a challenge that's facing us. The next issue within the urban ring is livability. So in order for people to want to live there, we've got to make sure that as we do infill development, which could be, better utilizing the land that is there instead of, say, large surface parking lots, you can start thinking as land becomes more scarce, parking underground, having taller stories on buildings so that we're not using up so much land for so little density. But as we do that, we have to think about parks and trails and access to green systems, because if the urban ring, as it grows and develops, becomes very hot and treeless and the park's over there, but you can't get to it because you have to cross 6 lanes of traffic at Pantops, and it's dangerous. We're not going to be able to achieve that balance where we're bringing lots of people into the urban ring, but we also need to make it green and livable and breathable. So that's my concern. You will see when you go to the comprehensive plan goals, it does talk about, we need parks, we need green systems. These things are acknowledged. My concern is that I don't know how they happen. I don't believe that Albemarle County will be able to achieve that balance of access to nature and green spaces for recreation, mental health, and also for habitats, just by hoping that developers will proffer or offer up green space and trails as part of their developments. I believe we need to actually invest our own county dollars in more land acquisition, more trail development, and more easements to create a robust green network. So that's some of my concerns with the urban ring. A couple other things that also come into that. This is getting into the weeds a little bit, but literally, but we do not have standards for planting trees and taking care of trees as part of development. So if I'm a developer and I want to propose to the county, I'm going to add some trees as part of my parking lot. We don't have, for example, a list of trees that are appropriate or inappropriate for a parking lot. We don't have standards for how those trees should be planted. We don't have standards for how the trees should be planted when they're along a public right-of-way or within a development. And so we do have problems with trees dying, and we don't have any obvious way to go in and make sure they live. And there are some malls in the county where the trees are suffering and dying off. And that's because they were planted improperly and not cared for. So the good news on that is I was assured that the county would be developing some standards for landscaping to make sure that the vegetation we do put in our urban areas doesn't die. So I'm very hopeful, and I'm not just going to hope. If the county doesn't come up with this as part of the zoning ordinance rewrite, then I'm sure Lonnie and I will be proposing some standards to the county. And just a quick note on that point. The Planning Commission can bring up topics. We're not merely passive. If the county is not addressing something that is of concern to us, we have the ability to add items to our agenda for discussion. Okay, so that's trees. And then dark skies is another issue that I am passionate about. I have been told that the county is actually going to be updating the dark skies ordinance. That's our lighting standards. Right now, we do have some progressive standards in place, such as making sure that lights are full cutoff, meaning that the light can't spill over onto adjacent properties, that it needs to be cast downwards. This is really important, as all you environmental people know, for species to not be confused by night lights, as well as just our own sense of peace and well-being, if that we're not flooded by constant light pollution. I haven't seen that ordinance. It was in the last comprehensive plan that we would update the dark skies ordinance. This current comprehensive plan environment section doesn't say anything about dark skies. I'm not sure if it's not in there because it's going to be dealt with as part of the zoning rewrite, or whether that's something that needs to be put back there as a priority. The next item I want to touch on is stream buffers. You may know that at our next Planning Commission meeting, we actually will be talking about a process to go back in time to re-up our stream buffer ordinance. And I'm not going to steal Lonnie's thunder, so I'll let him talk more about that. But we are beginning the process to fix the stream buffer ordinance, which was dramatically weakened by some past administration, I'll just say. So it's our stream buffer ordinance was progressive. Albemarle County was very progressive for having protection of the 100 feet on both sides of the stream, except in agricultural areas. But it was weakened to only apply to redevelopment projects or active development projects, and not just to all streams. So I'll let Lonnie explain that, but we're starting the process of fixing that. Another item that needs to be addressed in our comp plan, just as perhaps through a statement of importance, is balancing the need for solar power and clean energy with large utility scale solar projects that have the potential to take up a lot of land and also to potentially destroy forests or prime agricultural soils. The county is drafting a solar ordinance, and we have had some work sessions on that already to talk about the elements we would like to see in the ordinance. But as of yet, I do not yet have that ordinance, the final ordinance before us. I know that James City County recently started updating their ordinance, and they have the same consultant, so somehow they got ahead of us on that. But we really need to have strong policies to balance the need for clean energy. And I'll just end that comment by saying where I'm coming from is it doesn't make sense to remove a mature forest that's sequestering carbon and replace it with solar panels whose job is to reduce the use of carbon, right? So we really need to keep those carbon sinks intact in our county. Okay, so that's a big one for me, is just balancing that. And our climate action plan talks about the importance of energy conservation and clean energy, but I'm not sure it really addresses the utility scale solar enough. So we will have an ordinance for that hopefully soon, and I hope that it will have all those guidelines in there and hopefully requirements for avoiding parceling the landscape, destroying mature forests and prime soils. All right. Next thing, the biodiversity action plan. That is a great strategy that was developed several years ago, and the comprehensive plan references it, and that's got a lot of specifics in it. But I know there's a desire and a need to update the data that went in to inform that plan, and also to take a check on how we're doing with implementation of that. Part of that process developed maps, and this is actually referenced in some of the comp plan goals of large intact forest blocks and other large intact interior habitats and corridors that connect them. That mapping was done, but it's now several years old. It needs to be updated. And then I would like for the county to use that information in two ways, well, more than two ways, but two I'll highlight. One is when a development comes forward to the county, one of the first things that pops up is our biodiversity action plan and our map of intact cores and corridors, habitat cores and corridors, so that we require developers to think about that and to try to not bisect habitats. The other element in which we could use that information, that data from the biodiversity action plan, is in the acquisition of conservation easements, or ACE program. The county is still acquiring conservation easements, but they disbanded the ACE committee more than 2 years ago, and it has not been re-upped. And what's a shame about that is that we were in the process of adopting standards for using the habitat cores and corridors data as part of ranking properties for their importance. So right now, an example, we might acquire a conservation easement for a property that had really high value agricultural soils. That's a good standard, and it helps us to protect prime farmland. But we also can protect other types of habitats as well and give them points too. So not just instead of. And we drafted that ordinance language change, and then the committee was disbanded, so that didn't go anywhere. So I'd really like to see that brought back. Okay, one more sort of big topic, I guess, is just the whole rural area. I live in the rural area. I love it here. I love the beautiful landscape. I love all the nature and habitats. I plugged my house address into one of those fun little calculators, like how green is it where you live, and it said I lived in eco nirvana. I'm not sure that's true, but we have an amazing landscape with amazing natural resources, and so far we haven't really addressed how to best actually manage and protect the resources within the rural area itself. And there's not just one rural area, there's many rural areas, and they're different. They're different in their geology, they're different in the watersheds that are part of them, they're different in all kinds of unique attributes. And I think that we shouldn't just have one giant blob called the rural area. I think the rural area needs more attention and more thought. Some of the staff in the county have talked about this in the past, that we could perhaps create rural area plans and break the rural area up into areas that we could actually get more specific in terms of the management and conservation needs of those areas. So I know that PEC has suggested if the county doesn't do more with rural area planning, maybe they will make a rural area plan. So I'm very supportive of doing more to think about and plan for the rural area and its unique natural resources and agricultural economy and all of that. So we have not, the last thing I'll say is the Planning Commission has been told that we'll talk about the rural area as part of our work session on land use. So to be clear, we still have a work session coming up where we deal with a lot of the environment chapter, and then a separate workshop where we'll talk about land use. But obviously, land use and environment are directly intertwined, and the quality of the environment is directly related to the types of land use that goes on there. So hopefully we won't divide those topics quite so bluntly, I guess I'll say. And so that remains to be seen in terms of what the staff comes up with. My final comment before turning it over to Lonnie is that, again, I want to emphasize that just because something isn't in the county's current goals for the environment or any of their objectives, that doesn't mean that Lonnie and I or others on the commission couldn't bring those ideas forward and say that we really think that this idea has been left off the table and we want it back. And, there may be some things in the past comprehensive plan that in the interest of making the comprehensive plan more streamlined, perhaps have been lost and should be brought back. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts and comments and things that are important to you. And then if you have questions, I'll answer them to the best of my ability. Lonnie and our planning commissioners, our job is to represent you to the Board of Supervisors and to the county. And so we are not sort of the drivers of the bus, but we certainly have a seat on the bus. So with that, Lonnie, I'll turn it over to you. I know you have a lot to add to what I've said and probably several topics I didn't even bring up.
Thanks, Karen. You covered a broad range of topics, including many that I would have covered if you hadn't covered them. I think the big thing that I would say is, unfortunately, many times comprehensive plans can make these broad statements like we're going to protect the environment or we're going to conserve the rural area, but there's not really a methodology for how does that actually happen. We say, okay, we want more green space. You mentioned the need to have more green space in the growth areas. Well, how does that actually happen? Are we going to acquire that? Are we going to purchase that? Are we going to use transfer development rights? What are the mechanisms that's actually we're going to use to do that? And I think we need to have some time to really sit down and talk through a lot of these things. I'm a real Gestalt sort of person. I believe that you need to sit down in a room and really have detailed conversations that transcend, some of these things about, conservation of the rural. The comprehensive plan is it's fractured up into these little chunks, but those little chunks are very related to one another. As you mentioned, there's a deep connection between land use and the rural area, between transportation and the environment, between parks and the environment. And so I think there definitely needs to be some broader conversations, in my opinion, that transcend these different areas of the comp plan and allow citizens to bring forward some specific goals. The way part of the issue is I struggle with the questions on the AC44 site is it's really at a high level of objectives that aren't measurable. They're very vague at this point. And so it's hard to even evaluate them. And it's hard to even say what objectives are missing because we don't even know how we're going to accomplish these things, right? So going back to some of these things, one of the urgent things that's coming up, as you mentioned, was the Back in 2014 or prior to 2014, we had an excellent water protection ordinance that protected all of our streams, that, or at least pretty well protected the streams. It required a 100-foot buffer on the streams perpetually. Mysteriously, after that, it was brought before the Board of Supervisors that was supposed to be like a routine code cleanup. And when the dust cleared, suddenly we no longer had perpetual buffers required on streams in the rural area. And the only time we enforced the stream buffer was when 10,000 square feet of soil was disturbed. This is a real problem because often the rural area development happens without ever disturbing 10,000 square feet of soil. And also it means that developers figured out they could remove streams 9,000 square feet at a time. So effectively our water protection ordinance it had, holes you could drive a Mack truck through. And so hopefully that's what we can get around to talking about fixing when this comes up at our next meeting. This gets down to, how do we, as I said, I think we need to look at some of these policies in detail. You mentioned the dark skies ordinance. I also think that's a very important thing for us to consider. I also think we look at the rural area, as Karen said, it's not all the same. It's not homogeneous. When you look at the comprehensive plan, when you look at the zoning map, everything for the growth areas, it's this beautiful mosaic of different colors, of different comprehensive plan designations and zoning categories. When you look at the rural area, it's all one color. So we're effectively treating it all as the same, whether the mountains, whether there's rare habitats, whether they're former rural industrial properties, whatever they are. And I think that if we're really going to get serious about conservation of the rural area, we need to look and not just treat everything the same, but actually come up with some different strategies for different kinds of areas in the rural area. And so, so with that, too, I think some of the specific threats that the rural area has, when they decided, when the rural area first created, they decided you could make as many 21-acre lots as you wanted in the rural area. The board of supervisors at the time said, well, this will allow someone to have a 21-acre farm. No one would ever have a lawn that's 21 acres. Well, of course, now we know that's not true. There are definitely people in the rural area with 21-acre lawns. And so, the proliferation of McMansion is a big problem in a rural area. And it's a big problem because it eats up a lot of area that could be used for legitimate agriculture or for biodiversity and habitat. But also, we do have, some of the most affordable places to live in Albemarle County are the rural area. And if we are covering up the rural area with these 21-acre lots with huge mansions on them, no one's going to be able to afford to live in those. So I think I've long advocated that we need to rethink this whole system, and think about a way that when we're making subdivisions that we either cluster them or have smaller lots that are broken out so that we're not creating these big, farmette McMansion monstrosities. Another big threat that's occurring, my wife and I are botanists. We spend a lot of time looking for rare plants. And one of the things we've noticed is there's a whole lot of rare plant sites that are actually on the sides of roads. And as VDOT and utility companies are switching over from using mowing to using herbicide, a lot of these rare plant communities are being wiped out. And so the county does have the ability to be proactive in actually designating areas for being no spray, and neighbors themselves have the ability to opt into being no spray. In fact, all of Sugar Hollow a long time ago was opted into no spray because of its scenic river status. And so I think we should really look at things like, considering other places for no spray. Another thing that happens, as Karen mentioned, one of the important conservation tools are looking at where we have large blocks of habitat and corridors. Well, how a lot of these things get split up over time. There's sort of a gradual process of people building farm roads, and the farm roads become real roads, and then people will log the places out, convert them to pasture, but then the pasture becomes a subdivision, and so forth. One of the things that I think it's important for us to sort of interrupt that process so that it doesn't transition from a nice, healthy old forest to becoming a subdivision where there's no biodiversity whatsoever. And so there's several different ways to do that. First, I completely agree. We need to bring back the ACE program. We need to bring back, support conservation easements in the county. We also need to, one of the ways that I see this happen in the rural area is each time a gravel road is paved, it opens up areas for development, because no one wants to put the shiny new subdivision on a gravel road. So the moment one of these roads is paved, you have areas that convert from forests and farms to quickly becoming subdivisions. In fact, it's not uncommon for the developers themselves to propose the road paving. So I think we need to really reconsider the road paving policy in the county. I think we also need to look at things right now. When we think about roads and their usage, particularly in the rural area, it's very car centric. We don't consider runners, cyclists, and walkers in the rural area at all in any planning decisions. And yet there is real great data out there on where people are cycling, where people are running, and where people are walking. And in the rural area, as a rural area resident myself, there's a lot of health concerns. There's great data that show that as people live further in the rural area, their health declines because, ironically, a lot of them have less access to places to exercise, less access to healthy food. So preserving the few safe places that people have to walk and run in the rural area, I think is very important. So I think we need to start looking at those elements as well. Let's see, anything that I did not cover. I think the solar farm issue, certainly I'm going to be glad to see that come before us as well. Some of the things that we've been pushing for on the Natural Heritage Committee are pollinator smart standards. There's solar industry-wide standards for pollinator smart programs that include native plants and habitat within those designs. I think one of the risks is that there's been some big utility scale solar in adjoining counties where there's been a lot of grading and sediment flowing off these properties onto adjoining into streams and on adjoining properties. And that's certainly something we don't want to see happen in Albemarle County. And then a real disaster happened over in Chesterfield County, where there's a state natural heritage area that had a multitude of state endangered species that's going to be wiped out by a massive utility solar project. So we want to make sure that we have guidelines in place that when these projects come through for us, that we're not destroying the very things that are going to help protect us from the risks of climate change. See, anything else I'm thinking about? What did I leave out, Karen? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I couldn't find my microphone to click unmute me. We didn't, I mentioned the climate action plan, and it has a lot more specifics in there, but one thing to also be aware of, just climate in general, we can just say a few things real quick, like storms are going to be much more severe potentially in the future, and more destructive, and potentially also carrying more rainfall, more volume of water, because these hurricanes are coming up, and also just microbursts. Some of you may know, maybe a year and a half ago, Scottsville had a really, really destructive microburst that downed trees all over. It was incredible. We lost power for several days. Our office didn't have power for 4 days because the power pole broke. And apparently power poles are in short supply because of all these storms. So the fact that we're going to have these more severe events means that we need to be better prepared for emergency response with debris management, with just making sure that people are safe, and also what to do when we have large events with lots of water. The other thing is that as the climate warms, species are moving north. So a way to think about that is like Georgia's getting Florida's species, and some of them are invasive species. You know, the Carolinas are getting the stuff from Georgia, Virginia is getting stuff from the Carolinas, and so on and so forth. So there's sort of a northward march as the climate is warming, and some of these things are not only invasive species like invasive plants, but also, or trees, but also insect populations that cause problems are able to have an additional breeding cycle in some cases. So we're getting worse outbreaks of things of like southern pine beetle. So there are a whole host of other resiliency concerns with changing climate and changes to our ecosystems that we need to face. Now, is the comp plan how we address that? Not necessarily, but I can go back to things I was mentioning earlier, like, having the right standards for what trees to plant here. You want to plant species that will be resilient to these more dramatic weather events and, potentially longer periods of drought and longer periods of wet.
Yeah,
So,
and I think those are really great things. And I think the topic of invasive species is very important. Up until very recently, we had invasive species on the recommended plant lists for Charlottesville at Albemarle County. And I think the county is working to remove those invasive species off their tree shrub list. But still, there's a lot of, I drive around Old Trail in Crozet, and I still see people planting burning bush and nandina and a lot of other highly invasive plants. So I think having a better invasive plant policy, in fact, there are ordinances that have been adopted by other localities that aren't able, that we could adopt in Albemarle County to better protect against invasive species.
I agree. Yeah.
There also, I think, for a long time, we've recognized flood hazard from dams. We've had a flood hazard overlay. And so I think we need to start thinking about maybe fire hazard. I worry about, development in Albemarle County is creeping up the Blue Ridge towards the park. We see, development creeping further and further up, Jarman's Gap, in my area. And what this does is that it brings homes much closer to these forests that can catch on fire. Look at how dry it is right now. A lot of the mountains are brown. And it would just take one little spark to bring all that, to light that all up.
Yeah, I bring up FireWise with developers as well as questioning proximity to forests, like you're saying. And I've only ever found one. It was the applicant last week actually mentioned FireWise construction and site design. It was the first time ever in my 6 years on the planning commission that I heard a developer acknowledge that there are methods and techniques to make communities safer. But yeah, it's something we really have to be hyper aware of.
Yeah, so I think the fire risk. I think too, it's important to realize even just, past history in this area of Hurricane Camille, where you had massive floods that caused the mountainsides to just collapse, killing hundreds of people. It's almost like we've forgotten these lessons from the past, because once again, we see people building large houses right up on the mountainsides again.
Yeah.
And so I think we need to, maybe consider beefing up our critical slope ordinances and ordinances that keep people from developing on these steep slopes, do a better job protecting our mountains, because sooner or later we're going to be hit with one of those storms like Hurricane Camille again.
Yep,
and,
absolutely. So Lonnie and I have used our 20 minutes each, and we didn't want to talk at you all because there's a great brain trust on the line tonight. So we'd really be interested to hear your questions and also comments and recommendations that you'd like us to take forward to the Planning Commission. Issues that we couldn't bring up everything this evening because we don't have enough time, but please, we'd love to hear from you all about, questions or recommendations.
Okay, I think we'll just start working through. People are raising hands. And if you don't know how to do that in a minute, you can pipe in. Peter, you can start us off with a question or comment.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the presentations. They're very informative, and I appreciate your candor as well. I was just wondering, what enforcement mechanism or mechanisms are there for the biodiversity action plans in the county? Is there, I mean, was that envisioned in the adoption of these plans, and has there been any follow through on enforcement mechanisms?
Well, so to be clear, and I encourage you to, the biodiversity action plan is out there on the county website. I do encourage everyone to read it. It's not a plan of enforcement per se. There are some recommendations for ordinances in there, but there's also things about education and voluntary strategies. So it's much broader than just simply these are ordinances that we should adopt in things that we should be enforcing. So I mean, the biodiversity action plan does say things like, for example, we should improve our stream buffer ordinance, for example, which hopefully people will turn out and ask for the county to do next week. So,
What about corridors?
well, I see. So that's a very good point. Right now, so we've identified, taken this first step. We've identified we've identified these corridors, but we lack practical methods to actually protect them right now. I think at a very minimum, we need to bring back the ACE program with a scoring system, the county's conservation easement program, so that it gives greater points. It makes it easier for landowners within a corridor to get a conservation easement. So I think that's one obvious thing, making sure we have voluntary strategies that help get those lands into conservation.
I mean, I remember
one challenge that we have in the rural area is there's no, so I was gonna say, in the rural area, there's no rezonings in the rural area, right? All development is by right. So no one proffers green space in the rural area. People just build stuff. And so I think, we've talked in the past about having a clustering ordinance or another ordinances that would limit lot size or limit the placement of lots in such a way that those lots would be placed in a way that cause the least impact on natural resources. And so that's what I would support is redoing our subdivision ordinances so that we're not so that when subdivision does occur, that is done in a way that respects the landscape and doesn't put houses in places that are either put those houses at risk or that damage natural resources. Does that help?
I mean, the topic of corridors, or the issue of corridors, is directly tied to climate change.
Yep.
I remember seeing a Nature Conservancy kind of flow map of the entire United States, detailing species migrations due to climate change. The Central Appalachians was the hottest spot on the map.
Yeah, if I can comment, I mean, Karen's group, Green Infrastructure Center, mapped out sort of relatively continuous blocks of forest where there could be forest pathways that would work as corridors. You also had issues that were brought up in the biodiversity plan. For example, roads, interstates in particular, can be a barrier to movement. Lots of bears and deer get killed every year on I-64, for example. And there are some recommendations in there that come from some work by actually a person who worked with VDOT on how things like passages could be put underneath highways like 64, which I understand do exist, or how, for example, bridges and over streams could be designed so that there were footpaths along the edges of the streams under the bridges to allow animals to move. And then there's a committee member, Leah Jung, who right now is collaborating with Virginia Tech and looking into bobcat movements in northern Albemarle to get a better idea of how they use habitat in northern Albemarle. And I understood, and I'm not sure, but I understood one of the hopes was eventually that might help identify a place that might be a passageway across Highway 29, perhaps in southern part of Albemarle, where you have forest blocks coming fairly close together. So corridors are being considered. As Lonnie brought up, though, we're talking about land largely in private hands over much of the county. The park is really important, and one of the strategies in the plan was to provide corridors that lead to the park, so that this big continuous block of forest with all sorts of microhabitats in it could be kind of both a kind of haven in climate change and a chance to move north. But to get people who own land privately to protect and support these things, one, either they have to be very educated and financially and otherwise willing to do it, or we have to have things like the ACE program and so on in place to support it. And we've, to my mind, that the county has really been increasingly in retreat from support of some really important environmental needs and sort of thinking in recent years. And it concerns me greatly. And that's partly why this comp plan concerns me, because the planning staff that we have seem to be much more oriented toward development area issues rather than open space issues, even though open spaces are the vast majority of the county. And my hope is somehow, because the public, I mean, there's this long history, as Rob McGinnis can tell you, there's this long history in county surveys. And as you just saw who used to show up at public meetings, there's this long history of members of the public really valuing our open spaces, much like Karen was expressing at the beginning. And somehow we don't see that value being reflected in proposals that are coming out of planning. And it both baffles and perplexes and concerns me, really.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that, just to, put a fine point on it again. The standards for adopting the important landscapes identified in the Biodiversity Action Plan as part of the ACE criteria were already drafted. They literally canceled the meeting of the ACE committee and disbanded it before we could have our vote. And I'm not saying there's anything nefarious there. The county just generally disbanded the ACE committee. It was just really poor timing, but it would be very easy to just simply grab that criteria that we already drafted. We already had a copy of the ordinance. We're already working for the county with the county attorney on that, to pull that forward. And then, like wildlife tunnels are one of my favorite topics: tunnels, overpasses, pathways under bridges that already exist. VDOT did a study near Charlottesville, and I just posted a link to it. The wildlife tunnel they did as a demonstration was very successful. They used some fencing to channel the animals to where they wanted them to cross. They put cameras and they monitored the use, which was very high. And it's just a safety concern, never mind even the animals being able to migrate. Like you put them in the locations where you have the greatest amount of deer collisions and bear collisions. I've seen, bears hit by cars as well in our county. So the Infrastructure Act, the Federal Infrastructure Act, has funding for construction of wildlife bridges and tunnels. And I would love to see our county take advantage of that funding, because I think we have sort of a maybe once in a lifetime opportunity where there's a lot of funding out there right now to do some of these actions. And I agree with you. We need to have this information in our comp plan and put a strong emphasis on protecting our natural resources. And I do want to, I swear I'm going to say just one more quick thing and then shut up for a while. The goals and objectives, Lonnie mentioned this, they're very general, the ones that the county has posted for you to comment on. And anyone who does strategic planning knows that objectives must be measurable. And the way they're worded just says, let's have conserve some forests and conserve more of this, but there's no identified mechanism. So I just don't think they're adequate. It's more like restating visions, but we don't. There's different schools of thought. Some people think a comprehensive plan should have specific strategies and be measurable. And I've worked on those kind of comp plans for localities. And some think that they should be just general broad brush statements of values. And probably the answer is somewhere in the middle, but I believe right now that our environmental goals and objectives are too broad and too vague for us to be able to consider them as actual strategies.
Let me ask a question, please. This is Kirk Bowers with
Sure.
the Sierra Club. I'm
Mhm.
also a licensed professional engineer, and I was actually a county engineer for Greene County for several years. I know a lot about this topic.
Great.
So, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a moment. What can we do to get the ACE program going again? What is it going to take to get that started up? Do you have any recommendations on that, may I ask?
I think it was the Board of Supervisors disbanded it, so I think it's up to them. I would say to write letters or to contact your supervisor and ask them to re-up the committee, or at the very least to adopt the draft standards that the committee was working on before they pulled the plug.
Okay, and then on to the goals and objectives, the measurable goals. How do you accomplish that? And do you have any recommendations on that, either one of you?
Well,
Lonnie?
an example would be, and I'm not going to like read them right now because I'll get distracted, but
Okay.
I did post a link to them. Instead of saying like conserve forested landscapes and forest blocks as an objective, you could say something really specific like we just said. Post the intact landscapes and high value corridors on the county's website and require that be reviewed by developers prior to proposing a subdivision plan. Include standards, ranking criteria for protecting those landscapes and the ACE criteria for choosing conservation easements. Hold educational workshops with the public to teach new landowners about native plants of Albemarle County. I mean, there are grants out there to do some of this work, and some of it is just adding a map layer into the development, into the GIS database, and having the staff who review proposals have developers take a look at that. So, and then if the staff are continually educated on these things, they'll be able to show a developer. I've met with developers where I've said, if you shifted these buildings this way, we could actually create a corridor through here, and you could market this site as this lovely, eco nirvana, So there are things that can be done, but somebody has to have that as part of the practice of everyday planning. So, yeah, I mean, so I don't mean to talk over you or anything. I'm just saying
That's
that there
fine.
are very specific ways that you could bring this data into the planning review. That that could be something they look at. They could, when people are asking for rezonings or special use permits, we could pull up some of these data and maps. We could ask them to use native plants. Lonnie always puts a pitch in for that, but we don't have any way to require that. So we could give people extra points or something if they did that. So
Through the development process, the permit application process.
Yeah, you could say, you could add something in there that said, have you reviewed our habitat cores and corridors map to ensure that your development layout has minimal impact on this landscape, and some information about why it's important.
Yeah.
Let me bring up, this is my last topic, and solar farms.
Mhm.
At this point in our existence, we are on the brink of extinction. Quite frankly, it is really bad, and so we don't have a whole lot of options left. We've got to switch alternative energy, renewables, I'm as a civil engineer, I watch these projects pretty closely, particularly the one in Spotsylvania County had a lot of erosion control problems. The one we have here, we supported that project with the caveat that they do two things: make sure that they do not clear too much on acreage at once, because that's going to lead to increased erosion problems, mud and sediment in streams.
Did you have a question, Kirk, or did you just
Yes.
want to tell us?
We lost you for a second.
Yeah, that's part. This is the question. I'm sorry. Okay. I'm going to have to hang up. I'm not in a good.
Yeah, I think we're losing you, Kirk.
Okay, I think we're losing Kirk. Yeah. Let's see, Peggy has a hand up.
I do. Thank you, Lonnie and Karen, very much. And thank you for Civil 100 for organizing this. It has been very informative. I just have a practical question for you. I've written some comments to the Board of Supervisors about AC 44. When I do that, are you all copied on that, the Planning Commission, or should people writing their comments to the board about AC 44 also include the Planning Commission in their emails?
I would include, we don't, well, so what happens is we do get that feedback through AC 44, but it's sort of filtered through the consultants.
Yeah.
So I personally find it valuable to hear directly from the public about their comprehensive plan concerns. Maybe I'm different, but I would prefer to hear that input directly, because I mean, a lot of it gets lost in translation by the time it gets consolidated by the consultants.
Right.
I agree.
I mean,
I agree. And Lonnie and I read all our emails, and we try to respond to each one to say we've read it and we understand where you're coming from.
I will add the caveat that sometimes I get form letters where they're like 20 emails, they're exactly the same. I may not necessarily respond to each one of those. Maybe I should.
Okay, thank you. Well, any further emails that I write, I'm going to be sure you guys are also receiving it. The planning.
Yeah, that would be good, because also realize that I think, and I'm going to just sound a little, I almost wish we weren't recording this meeting, because I'll just say that sometimes I feel that people just write to the Board of Supervisors because they'll say, well, they're the final deciders. But I can tell you, like, at least I can speak from myself and my supervisor, Jim Andrews. Jim looks to see what I said. He looks to see what the Planning Commission said, and he takes our input very seriously. And in fact, their last comprehensive plan discussion, they basically followed our lead and appreciated. We went into a lot of depth, and they really appreciated that. So if we don't have your comments, they might not come. It might be something really important that you need to tell us that we should have in our dialogue, so we can make that recommendation to the board. So yeah, I would definitely copy us as well. If it's something where we've already met on that topic and you're writing to the board, you can still CC us, because everything will come back to us. The comprehensive plan is actually supposed to be created for adoption by the Planning Commission, and then the board votes to adopt it. We recommend it onto the board, so the buck starts with us, even if it doesn't stop with us. And this process that the county is embarking on is quite different this time around. So we're kind of they're putting stuff out, and then the public's commenting, like I said, and then it's coming to us. And so Lonnie and I didn't write those goals on the environment that you see, or the objectives. We had no hand in that. But we hopefully will have hand in them as they're redrafted.
We've got Bill Espinosa's got a question.
Oh, okay.
Actually, I had two questions. One is there was reference made to the 21-acre lawns, but the people with 21 acres can certainly afford to get their own resources to change that. But is there any thought to given to increasing educational efforts and/or incentives for people with smaller lawns to look at alternatives like mini forests, like meadows and so on. And the same is true in a way about trees in a lot of areas. I mean, I live in an area where there's some trees, magnificent trees, but I know they're not going to be there forever. And it's not clear who would be able to replace them, how they would be replaced, whether there is good information and incentives available for what we call them middle to upper middle class areas, suburban areas that have both lawns and tree issues. So that's one question. I would think it'd be very valuable if there were a center where people could go to get this sort of information.
Well, there actually is. So one of the great resources in our community is the Thomas Jefferson Soil and Water Conservation District. So if you're not familiar with your conservation district, they are made up of elected officials. I used to be one. Yeah. And they do have incentive programs, both for large agricultural properties, but also for homeowners. And in Albemarle County, actually statewide, we have a program called the Virginia Conservation Assistance Program that actually has money to do things like convert lawns to native plants. And so that has money for rain gardens and biofilters, green roofs, permeable paving. And it covers a significant portion of the cost of that, including design fees. So I would.
Lonnie, can I ask, is this on the county website or is this on?
It's on both. If you do conservation assistance,
okay.
Albemarle, you'll find it. If you do conservation, Albemarle, you'll find it. It's very easy.
Okay, because frankly, I looked once and was told, oh, there really isn't a place like that. I won't say by whom.
Oh,
well, I just put in the chat the link to the Thomas Jefferson Soil and Water Conservation District. Okay. So if you just move your little mouse, you'll get the chat bubble to pop up. You can click on that.
Yeah, no, I can do that. Okay. That's my other question is the discussion of solar. Part of the problem, in my view anyway, are regimes that are imposed by the state that limit community solar, that limit incentive for homeowners to have their own solar, and also and this is a broader problem, don't seem to incentivize long distance power transmission, which allows you to then put solar farms in areas that are already pretty degraded, and you don't need to and then you just wheel the power over into the areas such as ours where you really don't want to see trees cut down. Is there any way that this process can be used to at least cry for help and say, we think at other levels of government, we need some help?
Well, I mean, there's always the Board of Supervisors has a legislative agenda. I
was going to say the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's always that. I would say, we talked, not to beat it to death, but we talked about, how the rural area is not all the same, that we have areas of high conservation priority, our cores and corridors. And then we have areas that have a history of past industrial use and, or that are degraded in the county. We even have some Superfund sites in the county. There are places that are better and worse for solar farms to go if they are to go in Albemarle County. It would make tremendous sense to actually have a map that we could present to solar companies to say, are you interested in buying land in Albemarle County to build a solar farm? We'll put it here, not there. Because if you put it here, we're more likely to approve it than if you put it there. And we lack that kind of process right now.
Well, that's interesting. So what do you need to get a process like that in place? Because that sounds very, very helpful.
Well, I mean, we need comments from the public to ask for that process to exist. So when people fill out that questionnaire on the county's website, we need people to ask for that. We need people to write to the Planning Commission and to the Board of Supervisors, clearly expressing that we should take these areas into consideration and not treat our rural areas homogenous.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to thank both of you. This was enormously informative to me. So,
Tom, did you have something this evening?
Tom, I think you're still muted. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, I just wanted to toss out before we wrap up, since we're offering takes on what our concerns are in the plan. I mean, I have more than I could list in an hour, honestly.
Sure.
Having grown up with previous comp plan updates, and I find the current one extremely disturbing, actually. But anyway, there really are just two. One is very high level and one is much lower level. And one is, I'm completely baffled and perplexed by the fact if you work on climate action, which I kind of got involved with several years ago, if you look at reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and many others, over and over you hear we have to change the way we live on the surface of the earth quickly. We have to mend our relationships with the natural world. We have to understand modern societies have to be transformed in really radical ways, and soon or climate change will get away from us completely. And there simply is no recognition that I've seen in the comp plan that we're on the verge potentially of a real, kind of unraveling, which was talked about in the Club of Rome report that I've read from a little bit lately. And it seems to me in this comp plan, because in the 20 years that it's supposed to cover, we're supposed to be moving on transforming ourselves to contain climate change and live better with nature. Even if you can't go down to the fine scale details, surely there should be recognition of the necessity of this at a high level in the plan, and then it should show up in some ways in every chapter. So that's just one thing. The other is much lower level, although it's not in the weeds, but I'm appalled and astonished by the idea by just the dismissal of the rural areas chapter in the new plan structure. I mean, the rural areas chapter was this key kind of central element strategically and in thought and otherwise in comp plans in the past through recent years. And as Lonnie was saying, and I think Karen too, we have all these heterogeneous elements in the rural areas now. It's not just an ag, forestal, industrial zone. There are many different kinds of things that interact in complex ways among themselves and with things in the development areas, and they need to be thought about in some sort of systematic, coherent way. And it bothers me that I was told the other day at a natural heritage meeting, talking to staff, I asked, are there rural areas planners now? And I was told, no, there are no rural areas planners. And so somehow something is wrong. We're not seeing rural areas planning done within the county the way it used to be. And this is why I really have suddenly, when Rob made his proposal about a standalone rural areas plan developed in a distinct process, it seems to me something like this is really important and necessary to the county doing a decent job with its rural areas. The current plan, it seems to me, could be just a disaster by neglect of 95% of the county. Anyway, I'm done. I won't rant anymore, but I wanted to get those in.
That's fine, Tom. Let me react very quickly. I agree with what you said. So that's the short answer. And I believe my impression, I can't say this for sure, but my impression is that the comprehensive plan references the climate action plan, which is adopted by the county. And it says, go look at that. But I think you could make the argument that that's not enough, that we should still have a very bold statement or serious attention to climate change in the comp plan itself. And then the other thing is, the rural areas, I don't understand what the thinking is there, but these are all examples of comments that I hope I'm writing them down. We'll share them with the commission, but I hope also you'll communicate that to the entire commission. So it's not just me and Lonnie saying this, and then also to the board. So I think somebody else had their hand up.
Diane.
Hi, I'm Diane Saflarski. Oh, Ren, do you want to say something?
Go ahead.
Okay. I do have a couple questions too. Well, first of all, thank you for very informative talk. It's really brought a lot of detail and information to us. So just so I understand it, soon you two will be able to have input into this plan, right? Just that you
Yes.
feel it's a little bit later than it should
We
be.
just, I would like to have had some input before it went to the public to comment on.
Okay.
Because in my view, why wouldn't the comprehensive plan have the planning commission's thoughts in the information we asked the public to comment on?
Okay.
And I will just say, I have beat this drum and I have taken some grief for this position.
Okay.
But there it is.
Okay. And then has anybody really asked them, like, is this a visionary plan or is it like a detailed, goal-oriented plan? I mean, it seems to be frustration for both you and Lonnie, but have we asked them what their philosophy is? Like, is this the high level? And then next they're going to like list all of the specific objectives with measurable, goals? Do we know?
Here's my understanding, and Lonnie can comment as well. My understanding is that the past according to staff and the county administrator's office, the past comprehensive plan was too darn big, and you could also say that it promised something to everyone. And it overpromised, because then people would come and say, why didn't you do this? It says really right here, you're going to write a dark skies ordinance. You're going to do this and this. And you're not doing it. So the county said, we should have a more realistic plan, that we don't just stick everything in that everyone ever wanted. And therefore we just have a lot of disappointed people because we can't do all this stuff. So I think there is a desire to make it pithier, more direct, and not overpromise what we can actually deliver as a rural county. The second, and when I say rural county, I say like as compared to something like really developed like Fairfax. So there's that. There's the desire to shorten it, but is it going to get more specific? I don't know. I would like it to be more specific, because it says at the introduction that the objectives should be measurable. And then if you read the objectives, they are not measurable.
Okay. Yeah.
Because it just says conserve forests or something. You're like, well, what does that mean? An acre of forest?
Okay.
Which forest? Where?
I guess that'll be your input then when it comes to you, right? Official.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Okay. And I just have another quick question. So with all the development, like along 29 and, the development corridors, is the county buying any property to set aside like for pocket parks, or, a few benches here and there, like behind Kohl's or, over by Target, they're developing all that land up there. Is there any plan, I don't know what all, I don't know what's all being put up there, but I don't see any new parks being proposed along 29, for example. We have the old parks that are down closer to the city around Rio, but now in the northern. I was just curious if y'all know.
Yeah, so this gets down to how green space gets created. And I think it's important to understand there's only two ways right now that it happens. In one way is the county just outright buys it. Well, land in the growth area is really expensive. I know there's someone who wants us to buy a couple acres in Crozet for a park that would be millions of dollars for a couple acres. And so the other way, that more common way that we get green space in the growth area now, is when an area is developed, they then, like, there's a green fields, like a large forested area. Someone develops that large forested area. They clear most of it, but then they offer a sliver of it back to the county as green space. I call this the develop to protect methodology. You see this along the Rivanna River up in Pantops, where you see like people have cleared the majority of the trees by the Rivanna River, but then they've offered a sliver back to the county as green space. I personally think we need a better mechanism than this. Karen and I may not agree on this, but I think we need a transfer development rights program that would allow us to take those development rights that are in the areas we designate as green space and allow developers to move that development somewhere else. So that instead of just protecting a sliver of green space, you can protect the whole thing as green.
Mhm.
Um,
Okay.
And the benefit of this is that it's ideally if structured well, it's a win-win for all people involved. But that's kind of down the weeds.
Okay.
I'll just make a quick comment in response to a couple things. Yeah, we won't get there by just hoping developers give us little slivers. And the other problem is
Right.
that those are usually private to the development, so they're not
Yes.
a park that we can use. I
Right.
can tell you that in Charlottesville, as well as in other areas I've worked, I was on the planning commission in Charlottesville for 8 years because I just love planning. So before I moved to the county 12 years ago, so we had a network of where we wanted trails and where we wanted them to be connected. And it worked very well. The developers would say, okay, well, I'm going to build this. Where did you want that trail? Right here. Okay,
Mhm.
can you give me a variance on my sidewalk so that I can squeeze these trees in that you want? Yes, we can. So it or here's a wetland I can't use, but it's next to the park you said you want to expand. Do you want that wetland? Yes, we do.
Mhm.
So we actually got quite a lot of additional trail network created by having a strategy laid out and saying exactly what we wanted and where we wanted it.
Mhm.
If we had a detailed green space network created for the urban ring, then we would be telling developers, this is the connection we want made. This is where we want this to go. We haven't done that work. So it's piecemeal and ad hoc. And so we're not going to get what we need that way. Some localities take a portion of their tourism tax and give it to parks. Because the idea is like tourists are not going to visit your area if it's ugly and doesn't have green space. So parks should get part of the tourism revenue.
Mhm.
That can be done. That's not hard to just make that change. I don't think we need a legislative change to do that. Other localities do that. So there's also an option, and now gets it back at affordability. You could create a service district in the urban ring. You could do it for all of it or parts of it, and then people pay a little bit more in taxes, and in exchange, the county then has a fund where they can buy land for parks, trails, rec centers, whatever, and that is how places in Fairfax have funded creating more parkland in the development areas.
Mhm. All right,
Okay.
thank you.
Tools.
Got a question or comment from Ren?
Yes, I'd like to ask, I was at a Board of Supervisors meeting a couple of weeks ago with presentation by the planning staff. And there was an incredible amount of time spent on talking about activity centers that are being proposed or planned. And I think 50, and I actually have to confess, I came away not understanding really what activity centers are and how they are supposed to happen. Is that something you all can enlighten me on, so to speak?
Sure. So there's two things I'll say about centers. One is that all across the comprehensive plan map, the one that we currently have that for the old comp plan, which says how we want to grow and develop in the future. So it's a plan, but it's also a map. And it has like C's all over it near the development area. And the C means center. We want to put a center there. And it was well intentioned, but everywhere there was sort of like this area could be developed, and it needs a place where people can go to the drugstore or daycare or get their doggy, I don't know, whatever, taken care of at the vet. I don't know what's wrong with me, vets. I don't know. But then they would have the C there, but right next door would be like Route 29 with a vet and a drugstore. And we're like, why do we have to put a center in the middle here when everyone is just going over there? So there's too many of those. So they're going to create definitions for what they meant by center and then take some of them off because they're not well thought out. There is then also this notion that there would be these crossroads community areas that would be able to provide more services. The problem is that the list was not well thought out, and they just kind of grabbed everything that had been a historic activity, a center. So like people in Batesville in my district got alarmed, like, what? We're a center. What are they going to do? Like we're already pretty tight in there and we have our post office and our store and we're happy. We don't want any more stuff. So, it was just an ill thought out list. And I complained about it at the time and said, and asked if we were allowed to comment on it. And I was told you may comment on it, but this is the list that's going out to the public. So it's just caused a lot of angst because it's just a hodgepodge of places that have not been fully evaluated yet for whether they're even appropriate locations. So it's causing more confusion. And I've already complained on the dais publicly and in writing to the county. So I kind of can't do any more. I just know that the list will come back to us and then Lonnie and I can
Cut out.
we add some rationality to it, or hopefully it will already be culled before it comes to us.
Right. All right. Thank you. Thank
Or
you.
ever. Yeah. We didn't get to really edit it when we saw it. And I thought, boy, this is going to confuse people. And it has.
I would say that I would like to see them add another separate category. Forget like crossroads communities, but I think they should add something for free towns and the comprehensive plan. It seems strange that we have these historic African American communities. They're very important to the history of Albemarle County, and we don't even recognize them in the current comprehensive plan. It's not really an environmental concern, but it just seems like a big oversight. I know I lived next to one of these freed slaves communities when I grew up in Ivy, and it just seems like it was just this important part of the history of our county and an area that often has special challenges and special considerations that we should think about.
Right. So there's historic centers. And I think like I live in Howardsville. That was a very important center, but we're not using bateaus to transport tobacco to Richmond anymore. So, we still like it. We have a store, but it's not a center. So they just lumped everything together in this list. And so I think it's great for the heritage and culture and history section of the comp plan to talk about the importance of these places and then to bring them up when we're thinking about planning and how that developments could impact them and how to better protect them. And then separate that from places we're actually talking about as activity centers that, like I said, you would take your dog to the vet or you would, go to the post office or, so they've just mushed it all together and they need to pull back out those areas that are important to heritage and culture and history, but we're not suggesting that they become an activity center.
We're getting close to an hour and a half, which was roughly our target for the evening. I don't know, maybe I guess we should be winding down. I don't know, maybe if anyone else wants to bring up a topic while we have a couple of minutes left. Well, seeing none, I guess. I guess perhaps, James, we should start wrapping up the evening.
Okay.
I know I'm very grateful for Karen and Lonnie coming and speaking to us tonight because this is an issue of much concern, and both because of the knowledge they have and their role as planning commissioners, they bring a lot to the discussion we couldn't get otherwise. So the Seville 100 for the Piedmont group of the Sierra Club for 350 Charlottesville Albemarle. I want to say thanks very much to both of you, and we appreciate your time. And I'm sure some of us will be showing up and muttering into a microphone in front of the Planning Commission and the Board of Supervisors. And I'll just say there are 3 more Planning Commission work sessions on the comp plan. The next one's October 10th on natural resources and I think historic resources. Then there's one on economic development and perhaps some other topics about a month or so later, which is important. And then shortly before the holidays, there's one on land use. And all of these are important, and everybody who cares about the plan should think about reading the staff reports for those meetings and at least writing to commissioners or perhaps showing up and speaking. So I would just encourage that. James may have had a question or comment.
No, I was just clapping my hands in appreciation.
Clapping. Innovative use of the hand signal. Okay.
Yeah, I can definitely say that in past history, watching these processes over years and Karen could probably say the same. It's the people that show up, the people that are in the room, the people that speak up that make the decisions. So it's if you don't show up and you don't comment and you're not there in the room, then you kind of lose your say, right? You lose your ability to make a change in your community.
Well, thanks very much then. I guess with that, we can start to saying adios. All right, so I'll say good night, everyone, and thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
It was a
Thank you.
terrific performance.
Thank you. Our pleasure.